Today I'm traveling some 300 miles east to go to the oldest road in America. And I can guess what you're thinking. The oldest road in America? Wouldn't that be something like the King's Highway, which connected the colonies in 1650? Or perhaps the Lincoln Highway, which is the first of its kind to connect America coast to coast? And surely when we think of old roads, we think of Route 66, a very iconic and nostalgic one, but one that ironically doesn't exist today. No, I'm talking about a different road. I'm talking about the oldest road in North America. One that has gone by many different names. At first it was simply called De Soto's Expedition as the first recorded instance of someone trying to either conquer it or see what natural resources were there. The French simply called it La Trace. The English called it Path of the Choctaw Nation. The daring postmen of the time had a very elaborate name for it. They called it, and I quote, "The road from Nashville in the state of Tennessee to the Grindstone Ford of the Bayou Pierre in the Mississippi Territory." At the height of its time, it was simply known as the Old Southwest. There's one name in particular, though, that's my favorite. The Devil's Backbone. If Route 66 is the mother road, then this road would surely be the grandmother road. And if it's called the Devil's Backbone, let's go find out why. Come on.
I love you. Be safe.
Thank you. Our story begins in part here at the Mississippi, the second longest river in the United States and the highest volume of water discharge at 593,000 cubic feet. For some perspective, as a fly fisherman, I typically wade and fish rivers anywhere from 300 to 700 CFS. This is a lot of water. The Mississippi was really the I-90 of the 19th century. You see, this river connected the distant economies of the industrious north to the agricultural south. The boatmen, or cane tucks as they were called, would load flour, salt pork, tobacco, hemp, coal, iron, millstones, whiskey, and other goods onto flatboats. While Bingham's painting here captures the pastimes on the river during a calm, the river was not to be trifled with. Dead heads or submerged logs could punch holes through the vessels, shifting sandbars could render the weight stuck, and sawyers, which were rising and falling groups of trees, embedded in the river bottom, could strike the boat unexpectedly. The river proved to be a perfect way to float goods down. As Robert Campanella put it, people in power, ideas and innovations, information and perspectives, supplies and equipment, commodities and foodways, language and music, all traveled long distances, primarily by waterborne means, as they had for millennia. Typical flatboat journeys launched from the Ohio River at Rockport, Indiana, or Owensboro, Kentucky in the higher springtime waters when the current was faster, and a flatboat could travel at about 4 miles an hour. After 4 to 5 days, they connected with the Mississippi River on the southeast side of the state of Missouri and took an additional 3 to 4 weeks to finishing the trip, traveling at about 40 to 50 miles per day. While the boatmen sometimes did go all the way to New Orleans, the trip typically ended here on the banks of the lower Mississippi River Valley. The Kaintucks sold their goods and needed to make their way back home to the north. The river solved the problem of getting the goods down and getting the goods sold, but what about getting back home? As it turns out, flatboats would never see Kentucky again due to the strong current of the Mississippi. Boats were dismantled and sold for scrap. The boatmen had one option: walk back home. What they didn't know was that the most dangerous part of the journey hadn't yet begun. You see, this is where the story actually begins, because those Kaintucks had to walk a path, and they weren't the first ones to do it. No, that honor of those brave souls who first traversed the Devil's Backbone goes to the name of the town that the Kaintucks arrived in, Natchez. Combining the name of the Natchez people with what the Frenchmen called La Trace, we get the name of the Devil's Backbone today. Welcome to the Natchez Trace. It would be a dishonor to talk about the Natchez Trace without talking about those who lived here first, right? And settled this land. I'm here at Emerald Mound, right at the beginning of the Natchez Trace. This is one of the largest Native American burial mounds in the United States, the second largest actually. We know that these earthen structures were built by all the great peoples of the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River Valley and the Ohio River Valley. The Mississippian period was characterized by elaborate societies, settled farming communities, large populations, social hierarchies, and rich material culture. It's an incredibly sacred spot to be able to be here, and I just wish to honor those who helped pave the way for us today. You see, before the Kaintucks ever arrived, the Natchez were already using a series of connected trails to travel, hunt, and find water sources. However, the true pioneers of the trace weren't even those Native Americans. The true and literal trailblazers of the trace were those bodacious bovines that once lived in numbers well over 30 million.
So you got 5 minutes.
You are amazing.
See, we got
Oh yeah, there they are. Oh my gosh. That. Oh my gosh. That is so cool. The American bison. These majestic creatures had over the centuries created a network of narrow paths connecting the bluffs of the Mississippi River to the salt licks of the Cumberland River, following the natural ridgelines of the southern Appalachian foothills. In 1769, Daniel Boone relates seeing thousands of buffalo on the western Kentucky bluegrass. Such numbers occurred primarily at mineral licks that attracted bison from all directions, and they estimate at their peak held 2 to 3 million bison east of the Mississippi. By the height of the trace in the early 19th century, these majestic creatures were completely wiped out from the southern states. You see, it's easy to forget in our modern world, we have concrete and steel that spans causeways and bluffs and canyons in mere seconds. But the reality is, before all this was here, those majestic bison we just saw used natural ridge lines for trails. Let's go check out the old trace ourselves. Come on. It's amazing being on the old trace. I mean, picture this. It's 1780 something. You had just sold all your goods. You sold your boat, your flatboat for scrap, and you have to make it back home to Tennessee, Ohio, or Kentucky. You're sleeping on a hard bedroll, whatever you can pack. It's going to take you about 35 days to get back home. And your meals consist of dry cornmeal. And if you're lucky and if you made enough money, and if you didn't waste all your money on the ladies of the night and the other things that you could spend your money on in Natchez, then you maybe had some jerky. You have to make sure that the highwaymen or the robbers at the time, famous folks like Samuel Wolfman Mason and the Harper brothers, didn't rob you or kill you. You were exposed to mosquitoes, and you were reliant on whatever natural water sources you could find. So good luck with that. It's just such an honor to be walking along this route that postmen, pastors, merchants, boatmen, armies traveled. Native Americans, bison. This is a incredibly old pathway, and it is the oldest pathway, as far as I understand, in North America. And it's so cool to be able to walk this and think about those who paved the way for us, and that I get to experience part of this on a motorcycle, and without all of the struggles that they had to. I mean, compared to what I'm doing, I'm on a bed and in a camp, in a tent every night, and a lot of people are hoteling this, but even to my experience is an absolute luxury compared to what they had to. And it's just so cool to be able to walk that path. It feels almost sacred to be here, to be honest. It's incredible.
Walk 1,000 good miles from my hometown. 1,000 good miles.
On top of all that, one misstep could be the end of your life. If you broke your ankle out here, or sprained an ankle, or something of that nature, there was no one possibly to come help you. That was the end of the line. In fact, let's go read an account of a woman who I think is a legacy for this trail, whose story should be remembered. Surprisingly enough, one of the most common dangers to the travelers in either direction came not from the Indians or the bandits or even the weather, but from the spookiness of the animals, right? Hardly one of the people who tracked the trace and wrote about it afterwards failed to mention at least one incident in when a horse or mule took fright and ran away. This is the account of 22-year-old Martha Martin. In 1814, she and her husband and her infant daughter, Jane, left Natchez in a buggy. However, when they crossed Bear Creek, exactly where I'm sitting today, right behind me is Bear Creek. Somehow in the crossing, the animal pulling the carriage took fright and bolted up the bank and off the prairie. I thought my only hope of saving myself and child would be to jump out, Martha recalled afterwards. She stood and leaped out of the racing buggy, throwing her daughter aside into some soft grass as she did so. The driver, who was not Martha's husband, stayed with the careering vehicle and suffered an arm and several ribs broken. Jane providentially emerged entirely uninjured, but her mother landed on her left ankle and shattered it so severely that splinters of bone pierced her flesh and stuck out of her gaiters. After a servant carried her to a nearby plantation, Martha waited for 2 doctors, who examined the shattered limb and told her that it must be amputated or else she would perish. Her husband at first refused, but after she turned deathly ill in the night, he relented. At dawn, they were ready. My heart seemed it would burst, Martha remembered. I felt like soul and body were about to separate. She grasped her little daughter and what she feared was a final embrace, then told her husband a last wish that Jane be raised by her mother. After that, the doctors worked quickly. They carried her out onto the gallery of the house, laid her on the table, and began cutting at once. There was no sedative or anesthesia of any kind, and Martha could only say afterwards, "My suffering was only known to God and myself." She spent 12 days recuperating at the plantation and another 6 with nearby friends before her own doctor came to take her back to Natchez. In a nightmarish deja vu, the horse pulling the doctor's buggy spooked when some Choctaw seated at the roadside arose to wave as they passed. The animal began kicking the front of the carriage with its back legs until Martha feared it would break through and injure her. Entirely forgetting her own recent injury, Martha jumped out of the carriage on instinct and came down on the end of her amputated limb, driving the remaining bone clear through the still healing stump. Blood flowed from the wound, she said, like pouring water from a pitcher. Only her doctor being near at hand saved her life, and even then she spent 2 weeks in bed before the physician determined he would not have to amputate even more of the leg. After another month of recuperation, she set out with her husband on the trace once more, and this time reached Nashville, though not before she made a show of independence by throwing her crutches in a creek and refusing ever to use them again. For the rest of her 94 years, she hopped on her right foot instead, a living testimony to the spirit and resilience of a frontier woman and of the unexpected dangers that lay on the road. Martha Martin is a hero to me. She's an inspiration, and I hope that my life can have the same spirit of resilience, living testimony to that.
1,000 good miles from my hometown. 1,000 good miles. Years have come and gone.
Everything began to change after a 1798 treaty with the Chickasaw and Choctaw Native Americans, sparked by the Postmaster General's complaints of the expense of the mail and the occasional death of his postman. At this time, the trace was still only a single path wide, just like the bison had carved it out. Troops began to improve the trace beginning in March of 1801 with parties of 30 men each to be relieved once a month. U.S. Secretary of War Henry Dearborn wrote that the requirements for the improvement required that, quote, the road to be opened should not exceed 16 feet in width, and no more than 8 of the 16 to be cut close to the ground and smooth for passengers. The great object is to have a comfortable road for horses and foot passengers, and instead at the expense of cutting a wide road, it is more important that the swamps and streams be causeways and bridged. Old structures like this Old Town Bridge still somewhat stand today. This one in particular is the oldest known bridge in all of Tennessee. But the devil would not be tamed. Even the army gave up trying to clear the trace in 1803, having only cleared about 56%, or 256 of the 444 miles that they originally set out to clear. But you can't really blame them, because I'm out here at a cypress swamp, and it's a beautiful place to be able to walk across a bridge today. But back then, it would have been a pithy and pigpen job to try to either drain or bridge. It really wasn't until the War of 1812 that really legitimized the use of the Natchez Trace. During that war, it was believed that there were British troops down in the Gulf. And so, having traveled the Trace other times, there was none other than General Andrew Jackson who dared enough to lead his troops down to the Gulf using the Trace before it was really developed that much. It's interesting because my great-great-grandfather was actually named after Andrew Jackson, and his name is Andrew Jackson Bell. In 1830, Jackson and his cavalry marched to Natchez, and when troops were released without participating in the battle, the entire 2nd Division of the Tennessee Regiment had to slog their way back along the Trace. Though the road was the best choice at the time, the troops had to contend with knee-deep mud, oxen dying from the heat, an occasional rattlesnake, and according to soldier A.J. Edmondson, so heavy a shower of hail and rain that ever fell upon poor soldiers of the world. It was during this trip up to the Natchez Trace that Andrew Jackson earned his nickname, Old Hickory, reflecting his toughness and durability. Well, the Tennessee River here, right behind me, is easily crossed today via the John Coffey Memorial Bridge. During the day, anyone, including General Andrew Jackson, would have had to pay a pretty hefty ferry that was run solely by the Choctaw Native Americans. Quickly, locals who lived near the path saw an opportunity to make some money. Homes here like Mount Locust quickly turned into rugged hotel taverns, looking to make a quick buck off a lot of the cane tucks that were going through. These homes, or inns, are known as stands, and there were over 30 of them all across the Trace.
This is the only one left.
This is the only one left. That's it.
Yep.
That's okay.
And probably the reason why is because this house and the land here that we're on here was in the same family from 1785 until 1937.
Okay. Gotcha.
So it made it through the Civil War.
Right.
And all of that remarkably.
Right. Of the 30-plus stands that existed, you can see clearly that the largest growth occurred after the 1803 Army road improvements. By 1810, 10,000 boatmen traveled the Trace each year. In contrast, 3,000 people attempt to complete a through hike of the Appalachian Trail each year, and of those, about only a quarter actually completed. In 1811, while in the early years, really, of the Trace major use, we did the impossible and defied nature by going up the Mississippi. Yes, going up that 593,000 cubic feet of water, pushing down on man ever since the dawn of age. And we did it all by a new power that we hadn't tapped into before. steam. By 1816, 5 of these super expensive steamboats were traveling up and down the river and were no longer an expensive means of rich people showing off, but a real and viable means of travel. By 1820, there were 20 steamboats on the river, and by the 1830s, which was incidentally kind of the height of the use of the trace, there were 1,200 steamboats on the river. And the Natchez Trace, at its very height of its glory, really when it was just getting started, was abandoned. Just like that, the most important and oldest used route in America was abandoned, and it gave way to the golden age of the Mississippi. Andrew Jackson was old news, and Tom Sawyer was the new kid in town. The trace wouldn't be touched for another 100 years until the Natchez Trace Parkway was put in. And just like that, the forestry claimed it was rightfully hers. William C. Davis writes that the trace was a victim of its own success by encouraging development of a rugged area on land that was not meant to be tamed. I think he was right. See you guys next time. No, it's a British bike. What's that? Love you, loves. Love you. I don't know if this is gonna catch on the GoPro, but it's 6 in the morning and this dude has his generator on. It's still dark outside, so I have to have a light. And he started this thing back up at 10:30 last night. Get out of here. Get out of here. Right here. Oh, I was just going the wrong direction.
When I see you coming back, I said, he's lost.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Where you from, buddy?
Idaho.
Idaho?
Yeah.
You came all the way on that?
Okay, well, I'm an hour into this trip, and I totally forgot that, 60 degrees is really cold. Let it be known that I made it all the way to a buffalo park, which is actually a bison park. And they won't let me in because I'm a motorcycle. So I was gonna get some really cool footage of me with some bison to, explain this, but this is all you get. Sorry. Ugh, that is creepy. Ugh. That was the coolest thing that ever just happened to me.
Now this is, we're getting ready. Today is our 20th.
Hey, Sheila, do you think I'm a hitchhiker?
Yes, we're going west.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you, Tupelo? I don't know. Buffalo Park, even though they're bison. That was amazing. I got the footage. We're golden. Woo! Here we go. If you want to know more about the Natchez Trace and the Natchez Trace Parkway, which I'm currently writing, get up to Nashville and all the development, I've I think I've read pretty much every book that anyone has written about it, but the best one is called A Way Through the Wilderness. A Way Through the Wilderness by William C. Davis. It's the best written, it's the most comprehensive, it's the most researched, and every chapter is about the road to something. A road to empire, the road to Nashville, the road home, the road to God, the road to knowledge, the road to enlightenment, the road to rule, the road to ruin, right? Because this trace, that's what it is. It's a journey of finding God, of conquering, of war, of love, of peace, of travel, and ultimately of human connection. So thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you next time.